today we start the first online talks from the series of the post-COVID world conversation. And every 2 weeks or so, myself and Michelle are planning to host discussions like this on the most challenging, most important and interesting topics with our young, influential and very knowledgeable speakers like today's guests, Bjorn, Ihler from Extremely Together initiative of Kofi Annan Foundation, and Nasra Ayub from Integrate UK. And I'm going to let Nasra to go first to introduce a little bit herself and what she does.
Cool. Thank you for having me. So I'm Nasra Ayub. I'm a 23-year-old activist from Bristol. I do a lot of work around violence against women and girls, and also racism, Islamophobia. So a lot of the niche sector that I do work around is female genital mutilation, child sexual exploitation, honor-based violence, and racism, just in the general sense. So I train a lot of young people in the UK, professionals on these issues, and also speak out a lot on online platforms and through my writing for national papers on these different issues. I guess that's kind of like a whirlwind of what I do.
Cool, thank you. And I'll give a word to Bjorn also to elaborate a little bit on what he does.
Yeah, it's good to meet you all and meet you, Nasra. I'm Bjorn. I live in Sweden right now. I'm from Norway, and I've been working in countering violent extremism for the last 9 years after myself being kind of wrapped up in a terrorist attack in Norway in 2011. Been working a lot on far-right extremism in Europe, as well as extremism and radicalization and hatred and all of the roots down to racism, etc., across kind of the West and Europe. And I've found that building more peaceful and more inclusive societies is something we have to start with at home. We tend to, in my part of the world at least, think that peace building is something that we need in the rest of the world and not so much in our own streets, but it's definitely something that we have to keep in mind everywhere in order to make the world better in a sustained way.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for joining us today. And I think we're gonna roll to our topic, today's discussion. We decided to start this conversation with the most actual topic, I think, as in the past several months, the majority of countries have been living under this restriction related to the pandemic, COVID-19, social isolation and quarantine, and then social distancing. We were encouraged by all possible means. And at the same time, we witnessed unprecedented rise in protests and riots on different points, I would say. We had campaigns from healthcare workers to citizens who were not satisfied with the weaknesses of governmental social support system. We had businesses and entrepreneurs who raised their voices against absence of the governmental support in the private sector. We had NGOs sector who allowed for slow governmental response in aid for vulnerable communities. And on the other hand, we had many nations restricting freedoms and rights of their citizens, strengthening police and military power, like what happened in Russia as well, where police was granted unlimited, almost uncontrolled power to use arms against citizens, breaking the self-isolation regime, which is not even a legitimate thing for imposing such laws, as the country was not announced as being under the emergency state. And weeks later, police brutality on the other side of the world fueled Black Lives Matter movement and turned the whole world into anti-racial fight. So COVID-19 is not anymore the most discussed topic, even though we are not declining in the numbers of infected. And I know that for many that coming was not obvious, and then some people are left confused from such a fast shift. So I wanted to ask our guests, who wants to start first, Can you share your ideas on the role of pandemic in today's events? Bjorn, Nasra, who want to take it first?
Okay, I can go first. That's fine. I think in terms of like what you say, the role of the pandemic in today's events, I think it's quite interesting because in the UK context, is an interesting dynamic to look at because you have this kind of pandemic and you have this virus that's affecting Black and minority ethnics disproportionately. And then you have this Black Lives Matter movement that is also kind of a massive topic and something that people have been fighting for a very long time, just re-erupted. So I think it's quite interesting to see how these two go hand in hand in the sense that people are talking about Black Lives Matter and they're saying, yes, we need to kind of address the racism that's happening in the UK and worldwide. We're here, we're standing with our American brothers and sisters, but yet we also have a problem in the UK. And, you know, you see this a lot with this notion of the UK isn't innocent. So we see this growth in the rise of a lot of deaths in the UK. And then you ask yourself, who are the people who are kind of like, who's disproportionately being affected? And then you see it's Black people, it's people who are coming from minority ethnic backgrounds, and it's people who are coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So I think it's quite interesting to just see like how these two go in hand and how we are mobilizing not only to kind of just say, okay, cool, in the whole sense, we need to look at and address the racism that happens, but also in the current sense and in the more kind of desperate sense, we need to look at the fact that Black people and minority ethnics are dying in the UK because of this virus. And it's not because the virus discriminates, it's because of the structural issues that exist within the UK. And I'm sure this is the case for places around the world. And I think it's frustrating when you see the government that are not taken into consideration and not actually being like, you know what, we can understand that there's a racism problem in this country. They don't want to say it. They don't want to take that on board kind of thing. They're more like, oh, we don't have a racist issue here. And I think until we kind of admit that there's racism happening, we can't address either. We can't address racism as a whole, and we can't address the fact that it's Black and minority ethnics that are being killed most by this virus, and the fact that when they go to the doctors, they're not taken seriously. When they are in when they call for the doctors, they're not taken seriously. The way that they treat within the healthcare is just racist in itself, and there's again this movement that's come out of the Black Lives Matter again of racism in the healthcare. And it just goes to show that Black Lives Matter isn't just a case of, okay, we've got police brutality. It's a case of, racism is something that seeps through all aspects of society. And I think so finally people are starting to wake up, and I think for somebody who's an activist who's been working in this field I'm 23, I've been shouting about racism since I was 16. And I think it's been difficult to kind of see that whenever you're talking about racism, whenever you're saying racism is happening, like, these are the things that we need to address, and people are like, yeah, you guys are just, you lot are crazy, And then suddenly within a week now, everybody's mobilizing so quickly. Changes are happening so quickly, and it's like, wait, where were you all back when a lot of us were activists all these years? Where was society? Why were we all asleep? Because the evidence hasn't been anything new. This is not the first video that we've seen of somebody being killed by the police. This is not the first time that we've seen these statistics of people being kind of murdered or treated, like mishandled just for the colour of their skin. So why is it now that everyone's starting to wake up and no one was listening before? And I think all these issues are the ones that are being brought up through this pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you. Bjorn, would you like to add something?
Yes, I think you're certainly on point with the structural racism that's behind the disproportionality and who's affected by the virus. Here in Sweden, we haven't really had a lockdown as such, but all the people who have been able to have been working from home, and of course the people who are able to work from home are usually white middle-class people, and the migrant community is disproportionately affected, and minority communities are disproportionately affected, simply because of the way in which the socioeconomics are dividing this country. And so it's kind of infuriating to see people who are like, we are not that badly affected in the large scheme of things, when there's certainly neighborhoods and areas of the country that are much more affected than other areas of the country. And that is very evidently racist just in how it's divided at this point. And then In addition, it's fascinating to see it in context of the protests that erupted in kind of early April. There was a lot of protests around the world against the global lockdown, and of course, Sweden not having lockdown didn't have those protests, but we saw them in the US and was on kind of across the rest of the world. And what was interesting back then was that a lot of the people who later joined the Black Lives Matter protests were very upset about the people protesting for the freedom to protest. And I was kind of standing on the sidelines and like, well, we should always have the right to assemble. We should always have the right to voice our opinions and to protest. This is democracy. This is a human right and something that we need to protect even in the face of a pandemic. And so staying true to those principles, even in the times of disaster, is really important. Not because like white people should be able to protest with their large ass guns to go to the dentist or hairdresser or whatever. Dentists might be okay, but hairdresser or whatever. But because we will eventually have calls for actual human rights issues, such as the issue of racism in the US and in Europe as well, where this discrimination has been going on for so long, and we've seen it for so long. And there's certainly been protests in the past as well, but where these protests are legitimate and where they have to happen and they have to happen in a democratic setting. But then at the same time, we see a lot of countries kind of bypassing their own constitutions, their own parliaments are being overruled by emergency legislation. The police has no regard whatsoever for people's rights to assemble and to have democratic gatherings and protests, and they use the pandemic as essentially a tool and for repression, and that's really problematic as well. So there needs to be an understanding of we have these rights that we take to be fundamental, and we need to protect them in order to be able to have these protests that we're having right now. And I think it's important that we have these protests that we're having right now. However, it's also, as Nasra touched upon, really in some ways infuriating to those of us who's been following Black Lives Matter for the better part of the last decade, as well as all of the anti-racism work and the marches and protests that have been going on for the better part of the last 4 centuries. It's a long-standing issue, and it is kind of strange that it's stepping up to the level it is right now. But I think there's several factors in that. I think it's COVID has locked everyone in their apartments for the last couple of months, and people are kind of bored of that. And so something happens on the news, and people are like, "We can do something," and then do something. And that is an important cause to do something about. And it's good that we've found this opportunity to all get together to say, finally, Black Lives Matter. We finally had the European Parliament say it on Friday, which was really exciting. Which it's great. But at the same time, it should have been said a long time ago. And then kind of the vacuum of nothing happening because of COVID has certainly created a space for it. But then also it must be seen in light of the elections coming up in the US, and in the grand scheme of things, like Trump starting his campaign, I think yesterday or the day before in Tulsa, on the anniversary of big things happening there. Certainly is a sign that the election in the US coming up is not only an election about the presidency, but also an election about the standing of race in a country where racism has been rampant for the last, since essentially the country was discovered by Europeans many centuries ago. So yeah, been a crazy couple of weeks.
Yeah. And I was wondering if you've mentioned that this exact vacuum that we all experienced during the lockdown, it sort of like made people look really close to the events that happens in first of all in the US, but then in the rest of the parts of the world. So, do you believe that that such tragedy that happened with George Floyd was inevitable to set a fight that leads to social change? And can we actually avoid such things, or are they just a part of the revolutions, the movements, the change process?
I mean, what happened to George Floyd is not at all unique. It's been happening in the US plenty of times, and we've seen videos of the same thing happening to several other people. And we've seen it's even happening after Floyd died. There's been recordings of police brutality against Black Americans. But we've also seen police violence against Black people in the rest of the world. Adama Traore, my French is bad, in France, was murdered by cops on his birthday a couple of years ago. His sister is running a massive campaign in France for Black lives. And so this is certainly not an isolated event, and it's not isolated neither in time nor in space to the US. Like racism is everywhere and has to be fought everywhere. And I think that's really kind of one of the key messages. But the fact that it's getting so much attention right now is certainly something that might lead to actual change. Although at the same time, it's really hard to get to kind of the root causes of the racism, the roots of the violence. And I'm not sure we are able to address it in a proper way right now, because it's becoming so politicized with the electoral campaigns that are coming up, but also because we have all kinds of these distractions going on, like the protests that were turned into, to some extent, violent riots by potentially bad actors from people who wanted to delegitimize the protests. We've also seen the same thing happening with the entire debate about sculptures. Back in Norway, the entire debate has turned into a debate about art history rather than a debate about racism, which is completely derailing what we should be talking about. And so I think there's a lot of kind of complexities into the direction in which things are going. And it's hard to keep the focus on what the issue should be, which is we're killing Black people and we should stop it. It's as simple as that, but apparently it's really, really hard for some people to grasp the idea that we shouldn't be killing our citizens. So, yeah.
Thanks, Nasra. Do you want to add something to this point?
Yeah, like just to kind of add a bit more to that, I think when it comes to this movement, it's quite interesting, because I think what we see is society showing itself out a lot, especially again in the UK context, in the sense that, you know, people have been saying for many, many years that the UK is racist or America is racist kind of thing. And they're like, how can we be racist? We're the most, you know, affluent, tolerant society. Like, how can this be possible? And when the Black Lives Matter movement was, you know, kind of at its peak, especially here in the UK, we saw a rise in this all White Lives Matter movement and All Lives Matter kind of thing. And there was this lack of understanding of why are we saying Black Lives Matter? Why are we saying that we need to kind of fight for this idea of that Black lives should matter, you know? And I think it was quite interesting to kind of see, because we had like a protest here, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, where white people came traveling from all corners of the country to come to the and risk their health to come and prove that they're racist and to prove that they hate Black people, or to prove that, you know, white lives matter. And everyone was like, okay, do you know what, we're going to sit back, we're going to cancel the Black Lives Matter that was supposed to happen in London, and we're going to let you lot do what you need to do and show us what it's really about. And it was interesting because the media, the notions that they were using to kind of describe the protest compared to when we had the Black Lives Matter protest was very different. You know, they didn't want to call it violent. They didn't want to say, oh, these are racist. They were calling it like anti-racist and other kind of terminology and move around the fact that these were racist, explicitly saying, you know, they were burning like figures of like Black people. They were saying certain things that were very, very racist. And it just goes to show that, you know, we're in a time now where because people are more likely to be able to access the internet, we're more likely to have time to kind of be flexible and go out there, even though there is a pandemic, because, you know, a lot of us are working from home, a lot of us are put on furlough, a lot of us are, you know, not working at the moment. And I think it's kind of showing that when people have that time to kind of engage with what's happening in the world, because, you know, we have a lot of time on our hands at the moment, you see much more people coming to mobilize. And I think that's how social change is actually happening at the moment. Are we where we need to be? Absolutely not. Is there more work to be done? Hell yeah. Like when we're just at the tip of the iceberg. And I think, you know, people are still getting it wrong because they think, okay, cool. Like the way to deal with racism is to be like, we love Black people. It's great. Stop killing us. We're done here. No, 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 no. Okay. Stop killing us is the bare minimum that we need to do because we need to be alive first and foremost, you know. And then secondly, we need to be valued as Black people, not just, you know, oh, we're going to tolerate you. Why is it that we're tolerating in the 21st century, in 2020? Why are we tolerating Black people? And why is that a conversation in the first place? The fact that we're even debating about Black Lives Matter, the fact that we're even debating about racism and that we're not all on the same side, it's crazy. And it just goes to show that there's so much more work to be done and it's going to go beyond us. It's going to be hundreds of years before we even get to a place where we're like, okay, cool, we've gone somewhere where Black people are safe, because this is 400 plus years of oppression and, you know, slavery, colonialism, racism that's entrenched into all walls of society. If you ask about statues, if you ask about buildings, if you ask about the pavement and the lights, anything, you will see it somehow date back to colonialism and slavery. Somehow everything in history is linked to colonialism and slavery and racism in some form, if you look at society, especially in the UK and America. And I think this just goes to show we need to dismantle this. And I think this is the social change that needs to happen. These are the difficult conversations that we need to have in order for this social change and this phenomena to happen on a real authentic scale where it's continuous, not just a, you know, a peak for like a month and then we just kind of forget about it and let go back to our normal lives. Because right now it is a bit quiet on this Black Lives Matter movement, and, you know, compared to how it was a few weeks ago where the momentum was much more stronger. And I think that's what people are scared about, is okay, where do we go from here? What's next? And what does this actually mean for the rest of the world and for Black people that are kind of anticipating, what do we do now? You know, we've been trying to tell you guys, we all understand now that racism is happening, but Black people are still dying in America, in the UK, you know, in all corners of the world. And it's like, what do we do next? And I think that's what we need to kind of focus on and have continuous conversations over in order to get somewhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Nasra. I just wanted to follow because I've seen you being actually engaged in the movement in London, right? Seen some of the posts, and I know that the protest that happens in Europe, they're a little bit different, I would say, in methodology from what happens in the US. But there is a lot of debate right now that's going on around the methods that those different kind of movements in different countries taking place. And since you've been there, like on the spot, did you find out for like the method that you think would work the best for this movement not to die out, you know, not to disappear like it happened, you know, before many times? And what do you think would be the successful method, not to be blamed by the media for being looters or being you know, anti-racist and all of the things? So what are your thoughts on this?
I think of course, like in Bristol, just for those that don't know, obviously Bristol kind of was a very key component in the movement, in the sense that we were the first, or kind of we were put on the spotlight for removing the statue forcibly, and you know, that caused a lot of conversation and spark on not only around statues but kind of around the use of force in kind of achieving certain goals. And I think from an activist point of view, I think it's quite interesting. Does violence work? Does using force work? And I think I've been there in Bristol, being from Bristol before the protest. I was there when, we were sat at, tables trying to talk to authorities and people who were in charge of taking down the statue of the slave owners, and being like, trying to rationalize it, trying to have these conversations, trying to be civil. And these were things that were going on for years and years and years. And I think no one was listening. They were like, yeah, we'll change the name. Yeah, we'll kind of put a plaque next to it to show that, it's a slave owner. Yeah, we'll do this and we'll do that kind of thing. And I think it got to a point where people were like, you know what, we're sick of this. And I think it's interesting, predominantly at the protest in Bristol this time around, it was organized by young people. A majority of the attendees were young people compared to other times where it's usually older people that attended and community leaders who were in charge of it. So if you look at the protest that happened this time around, it was majority young people. And I think it was interesting because this is where the method changed, was when there was a different kind of demographic that were in charge of the protest. Now, do I think what they did was correct and right? Absolutely. And I think the reason for this is because I think if people are frustrated and they're constantly trying to tell you, you need to take this down, and you don't have the actual capacity to do so, and we as Black people, we have to walk past that every day. We have to be reminded from all the buildings in Bristol that are named by slave owners that white people, especially those who are like, we don't want this to happen, do not understand the gravity of why it's such an important thing to be removed. It's not history being removed, it's the glorification of these historical figures being removed. And I think that's what was interesting. Now, to go back to your question on what works, I think firstly, trying non-violent means absolutely does work. And I think I was reading up on a Princeton University professor who kind of studies protest, and he was saying how his name's Omar Sewell, I think is how you say his name. But yeah, so he was talking about protest, and he was saying how non-violent means actually work. And if you look at the kind of achievement of non-violent means of protest compared to violent, they achieve the same thing. Now, the issue is, he said the key component on making this actually become successful is the use of media, and how interested is the media and the public interest. Because if you are doing non-violent protest and the media is not interested, it doesn't matter. Like, it's really not going to get anywhere to the same extent as if the media is interested. And I think that's what's important is that to what extent are people seeing these movements, and how interested are they, and how, because now we have the social media to mobilize. If you look at a lot of people who in America were arrested for kind of protesting, or were tear gassed, or were put in hospital, the amount of GoFundMe pages I saw where people around the world were donating millions and millions of pounds, even to George Floyd's, millions and millions of pounds to these causes, and making sure that they were good, that they were going to get bailed out, that they had the legal representation. It just shows how, cool, okay, we're going to go protest non-violently, we're going to go do these things, but the rest of the world has our back, and we have the means to do that because we have social media in order to kind of push those kind of that momentum and that protection to some extent. Of course, there's going to be casualties in the process, unfortunately, but I think to some extent, non-violent means does work. Does a direct action work as well? Yes. I think if it wasn't for the direct action that Bristol took, I remember being there. Now, I was like to my friends, I was like, guys, are you seeing what's happening right now? Because they're not as politically active. I was like, did you see the statue fall? Do you know what this means? Do you know what this means? And they were like, yeah, like, but who is he again? Who's this guy? I'm like, let me tell you about this guy. This guy's Colston. He was a slave owner. He brought many, many slaves to this. Now, you guys don't understand. Like, this is crazy. And I go on social media 5 minutes after because everyone's posting their videos and it's going viral. And then what do we see like a day later, hours later, is Winston Churchill's getting kind of defaced. We've got other statues around the world being taken down. And it's like just that catalyst of somebody being like, you know what, I'm going to be brave today and I'm going to take this statue down because I'm sick of it. There's going to be a few of us. And then boom, now the whole world is getting involved. But I think it's really important that we kind of differentiate between, these kind of direct action and also what it means for the kind of the wider conversation, because sometimes you can take away from that as well. So I think using multiple different methods in order to kind of achieve the goal is really important. I would never say that, violence always works. But I think if we look at civil rights movement, I think a lot of times people try and utilize like peaceful pictures, like in Selma, for example, where everyone was marching together. They tried to use that picture, but actually just after that, violence erupted because of the way that the police were treating the protesters. And I think these are the things that people try and pick and choose from history. But as we know, violence does work, direct action works. Does it work by itself solely? No, it does not. We need to have multiple means in order to get somewhere. And I think this is something that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King sometimes disagreed on, was the use of violence in protest. But I think definitely using multiple means works. And I think again, like, it just goes to show that, you know, we have a generation now, we have a society, especially in Western kind of Europe, that are fearless. You know, they're fearless. And you know, right now, the people who took down the statue, they're trying to kind of have legal action done on them. But you've got the rest of the city and the wider UK society making sure that they have legal representation. You know, you wouldn't see that many years ago. The young people are trying to find lawyers for the people who took down the statue, and making sure that they have a fund, you know, a collective fund, in order to make sure that they're protected. And I think these are the phenomenon and the incredible, crazy things that we're seeing with the movement, and how, if certain means are being taken, that the rest of the generation will protect you, and they will try and do anything that they can, as long as, you know, we have that information online. And I think that's what's powerful, is this the unity that you see from young people and the wider society on making change in different means. We try something, it doesn't work, try something else, and we keep pushing. And, you know, change has happened because of that.
Thank you. Bjorn, would you like to add something on that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of kind of questions in here, which is the concept of use of violence and protests is certainly, you know, a big topic for debate. I wouldn't classify tearing down a statue as violence. Like, it's destruction of property, sure, but like at the end of the day, it's not really hurting anybody physically. And I think, like, if people are outraged about tearing down a statue, then like, shouldn't they also care about people actually getting killed? I mean, that's the basics of it. Like, a lot of the people who are really outraged about the statue seems to not really give a shit whether people are actually getting killed, and that's really infuriating, right? But then also, like, when you tear down the statue, that was great. Now everyone's tearing down statues. That's also great, but it really is also distracting from the real kind of heart of the topic, which is people are getting killed, and all of the structural racism behind why people are getting killed. And also, like, we should get past the point of like Black lives matter to like, people should be thriving. There's a lot of big steps to be taken, but sometimes the method and the means are overshadowing the goal. And I think that's kind of the tactics that are being tried by the opposition right now, is trying to escalate the debate about art history, as I mentioned, to a level where it completely derails the entire debate about Black lives. And I think that's really, really destructive, and something that the people who are anti-racist and who fights for Black Lives Matters needs to keep in mind, that we must not go into the trap of the opposition and let them use their conservative media to distract from what we're actually trying to achieve. And as you say, the media plays an essential role in protests. But there's so much that can be done, and there's so many creative options out there. A friend of mine, Sarja Popovic, who was one of the leaders of the Otpor movement in Serbia in the 90s, wrote a really great book about how to topple a dictatorship using Lego figures. And essentially humorous stunts against oppression. And I think there's a lot of research, a lot of work out there on how different movements fighting for civil and human rights around the world have been using all of these means. And I think that's really important. I think it's also important to not look at tearing down the statues as a destruction of property or a destruction of history or trying to censor anything, but rather as a means of trying to reframe it. Nobody knew the story of Colton really until people tore the sculpture down. Like, most people in Bristol, even, like, I've walked past the sculpture a couple of times and didn't bother looking twice at it. But now we know the history, and I think that really opened a lot of people's eyes to what is the history of slavery in the UK. I mean, I lived in Liverpool for 3 years, across the street from the Slave History Museum in Liverpool, which is really worth a visit. and the role played by the United Kingdom in transatlantic slave trade is enormous, right? And that is true for a large part of the rest of Europe as well. Like all of the countries in Europe has in some way or another more or less participated in slave trade. And reckoning with that history is painful, but really something that we need to do, and something we need to look beyond kind of the conventional history books, which often glosses over the darker parts of what we've been perpetrators of. And we need to look at what actually happened. Like, how did we actually become one of the richest continents in the world? How did we enslave the rest of the world through colonialism, through slave trade, through all these other repressive means that we used to essentially rule the world for centuries? And how did we come up with this idea that some people are inherently born more valuable, more worthy than other people, which is the fundamentals of how our monarchies works up until today, right? We need to look at these structures of how we view people and essentially set out the course for what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where some people, by virtue of which family they're born into, essentially are more valuable than other people? And like, I'm on the side of no. And I really hope most people are on the side of no if they really think about it. What's fascinating, though, is that a lot of people who are really outraged about tearing down sculptures and so-called destruction of property and looting, etc., which is a minuscule amount of what is happening anyways. A lot of the people who are the loudest and most outraged about that is people who claim that they are against terrorism, while in reality what they are supporting is a centuries-long act of terrorism against our minorities. And I think if you frame it in that respect, then it's quite shocking to see what's happening.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a little bit another point related to methods. And I think this is something that I was just listening to you, and I remembered what I've been listening on the news. Like, I mean, I reside right now in Russia. It has, it's like really far away from the matters of racial questions. You know, we have other things, other kind of racial things, but they go in on a little bit different level. But the interesting thing, something that I've learned from media, and that's going to be related to my next question, is that they try to present of what's going on in the world, whether in the UK or US, is that Black people ask, or let's say make white people stay on their knees. And you know, like all of the things, like how they frame this whole idea of like they just ask for white people to ask for the forgiveness for something that happened like way long ago, and these people were not directly involved in the actions. So that I feel that this message somehow is going on in the media and being fueled. Do you have any comments regarding this? Because I think it builds like a completely wrong understanding of what actually going on. But this is something that prevails here in the opinion of young people who are like, you know, probably they're willing to support sides, but they feel like really confused because they feel they are probably white people, you know, but they don't want to ask for the forgiveness for something that they were never done. And it's like, I feel that there is this a very complex issue that people started to raise the questions about their belonging to any kind of race, which was never a question, for example, for me when I grew up. At least I didn't differentiate this kind of things. So, but I noticed that there is a lot of conversation among young people here about this kind of methodology that people feel a little bit confused about. Maybe you can give some clarity on this, whether it's just the media that actually mislead this whole conversation, and there is something behind it that we need to clarify.
I think, yeah, first of all, the media is biased, obviously, like all media is. Um, and they are shaping narratives in the way they want to. And my simple answer is don't let them, which is not as simple as not letting them, because the other option is speaking out, which is, of course, harder in certain parts of the world than in other parts of the world, especially when a lot of narratives are controlled by strong political interests. And so it's interesting to hear you tell about Russian media, because I've obviously not been following that. But I also think for a lot of white people who don't understand the concept of white privilege, really, it's hard to see how we're part of a systemic oppression. But the reality is, like, George Floyd died 3 weeks ago. It's not ancient history yet, and it is a structural issue that is happening. We also see that it's a structural issue in basically everything, from who has essentially social mobility, who has access to education, who has access to healthcare, who has access to all of these things that many people take for granted, and largely, like, white people come out on top. And at the same time, it's understandable that it's hard for people who are white but don't necessarily feel that they have that access. Like, I can see the troubles of the 16 million or so white people who are living in trailer parks in the US, in understanding that they are from a position of privilege. But the reality is that they've never had to face or fight against racism. Their issues are not rooted in the same root causes as the issues faced by people who are facing racism as part of their kind of complex nature of issues. And so I think understanding the complexities of that is really tricky. It's also, of course, kind of hard to understand that we are a result of our history at times. Like, we are in the positions we are in because of the ways in which our ancestors have been living for the past couple of thousand years. And I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that the injustices of heritage definitely are there, and is something that we have to challenge. But how do you challenge that at scale in a media landscape where those opinions are not necessarily able to shine through, and where complexity is really hard to communicate in the first place? Like, everything that is being said anywhere in the media right now boils down to single lines, single phrases, and in that, it's really hard to essentially bring nuance to the table and say, yes, your life might suck even though you're white, but at least you didn't have to face racism, and and bring to the table kind of a nuanced debate around that is really tricky. And so the question is really, like, how do we have better conversations in the public sphere? And that's kind of at the heart of all my work, essentially, it turns out. Like, how do we have challenging conversations with people who disagree with us? It's hard. And it's especially hard when the media is biased, when there is strong political interest for not having an accurate depiction of what is happening, and an accurate depiction of the various sides of those debates. But reality is, it boils down to something as simple as, like, should everyone have the same opportunities in lives? Or should some people, by virtue of who their parents and grandparents and, way back parents were, be born into a world in which they are more privileged than others? Like, that's simply the question. And I think and hope that most people would agree that it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be the way it is right now. It shouldn't be that because my parents and grandparents and ancient history parents were the people they were, I should be better off than anyone else. I think we have come to a point where we should all have equal opportunities, and at least as like a baseline, as the most fundamental level, have an equal right to stay alive and stay relatively safe within our neighborhoods and streets, especially from law enforcement who are there to protect and serve, preferably, but who do a shit job at that most of the time, seemingly.
Thanks. Nasra, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I feel like you raised some great points, and I think the key important part, which was reiterated, was that you may face other forms of oppression, you may face other struggles, but your race isn't or hasn't been a barrier as a white person. I think that's just the key, simple aspect of it, is kind of having that conversation. But I think it goes, for me, I think it goes bigger than that, in the sense that we need to look at kind of how can we incorporate the kind of looking at Black history and history around racism in schools and in the curriculum, and making it part of the institution, because I think that's really important. A lot of us don't know about Black history, or how this history around slavery and colonialism has impacted today. I didn't know that until I got to university and I was studying a politics of sub-Saharan Africa module, and I was like, oh, hold on. So of course, it's much more complex than what the media tells us, or what I've learned in school before, because nobody has kind of thought, okay, let's delve deeper into what has slavery and colonialism done to today's society, firstly, and what has the journey been, and how does that involve white people. And I think that's the honest conversation we need to have, because I think unfortunately, when Black people talk about you have white privilege and this is the reason why you have it, and this is what it means to have white privilege, and this is what white supremacy is, unfortunately the mass are not listening. They don't want to listen. But when it comes from a white person, when it comes from one of their own, or it comes from somebody in the power of authority, they're like, oh, that's what they meant. Oh, okay, now I get it. Oh, white supremacy, And I think, unfortunately, that's what needs to happen, is that we need to put this in. We need to have this conversation in a school setting, university setting, college setting, in a formalized way, done by those who have informed knowledge on these topics. Not a biased kind of way where white people are seen as the white savior, or they brought the Bible to Africa and they brought civilization there, kind of thing. Because we all know that's not the case, and that is not true. And I think it's about having these conversations, because if we're not having these formalized conversations, then we can all truly and well go online and have these conversations on an online forum or Twitter or whatever, but we're seen as the leftists, the left group, or here they go again with the politics kind of thing. However, if you're actually learning about it in a more, again, formalized setting, it's like, oh, okay, this is actually what happened in history, and this is what really went down, and these are why these statues are being taken down, or why people need to take a stance against racism, and this is why they have privilege. It's not because if you're from a working class background or a poorer background that your life should be great, or the assumption that your life is great. It's the fact that your race will never ever be a barrier to you in life. Your socioeconomic background may be, your gender may be, your sexual orientation may be, but your race will not be. And that's literally what we're trying to say to you. And this is killing people. This is killing people. People are not being alive because of the fact that they're not white. And I think that's the conversation that needs to happen. And I think it needs to be in an accessible way, because when we talk about politics, how accessible is it to people? How accessible is politics and the conversation around politics and political identity to people who've never engaged with it before? And I think now, suddenly, I guess there's more kind of accessible information that's being put out that people can kind of read, engage with. If you see, look on Instagram and social media, there's short posts on what can you do as an active bystander, what does white supremacy mean, and you can just swipe through and it will give you a short, accessible way of telling you what that means. And I think that's kind of that's what needs to happen, not a complex way of having these discussions or an academic study to kind of tell you, oh, this is what happened. We need to have it in a setting where the conversation can be an interactive, active engagement between people, especially those who are like, no, I don't understand what white supremacy is, or I don't believe that it exists.
I think just one point I want to add to what you said about learning about history. Learning about history is really important, but it's also really important to learn what's happening right now. Slavery has by no means ended. Globally, there's more slaves today than there's ever been in history. At the same time, you also, just in the US, 13% or so of the population are Black Americans. About 40% of the prison population are Black Americans. And being imprisoned in the US means that you have no protection by the 13th Amendment, which means that you're basically available as slave labor, and so enslavement still exists, as enslavement of Black people still exists in the U.S. It's not history. It's still here and still in our societies. It's still something that we have to challenge. The same is true for colonialism. Like, we've changed the shape and form of it, but it's still a lot of it is happening. And I think it's important to keep that in mind and understand that, like, the injustices didn't happen just because the 13th Amendment happened, or just because we claim to have ended slavery. It's just we've rebranded it and marketed it better, but the injustices are still there. So learn about how the world works today, as well as learn about history, is just a key point there.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Bjorn. Michelle, are you going to continue with the questions?
Yes. So as you already said in the beginning also, that right now it was all over the different places in the world we had these movements. And also that the Black Lives Matters movement actually is not something that's just started recently, but you mentioned it already for decades. So do you think that this time it actually has the potential to be transformed into a truly global movement for social justice? Because also with the context that we had the pandemic and the lockdown, so it might also seem to be like a hype where people now take action because they've seen it. But will it also stay this way? Do we have any reasons for optimism? And do we have everything we need for a global movement to build, like, also this global movement? And if not, what would be missing in this case?
I feel like that's a very good question. And I think, I think I'm 50-50 on the optimism scale. And I think the reason for this is that I feel like, okay, on one side, I've seen more people that have never been involved in activism get involved, and I've seen more change in the last month than I have within my whole time as being an activist, I guess, my whole activist career of 7 years or 6. And I think I feel like, yes, there's potential for it to become a global movement and for a lot of kind of injustices against Black people to be addressed. But the list is far and many. Every single day or week we're finding more things about kind of what's going on in the world against, like, Black people. We have a slave trade in Libya happening right now. We have migrants being treated terribly and being killed and tortured in Saudi Arabia. We have just a lot of different forms of, like, injustice against Black people happening across the world. There's in Brazil, there's some movements over there as well because of the oppression of Black people, Black Brazilians. And I think I am very, very optimistic to some extent that, these conversations will keep going and we will keep kind of trying to make change. But I think for me, my fear is on the side of kind of the authority and those who have the power to make the change, because we can kind of continue to put pressure on them, governments and, those within power. But right now they're listening because it's in public interest. There's a lot of scrutiny if they don't listen. And if that scrutiny gets weaker, or if that pressure gets weaker, what does that mean for the government? They can just be like, yeah, we'll carry on listening like they were before, and change might not happen. And I think it's for a lot of kind of people who are activists, there's a lot of burnout that's going to happen. A lot of people are tired, they're exhausted. We've got this pandemic happening, we're always inside. And it's like, how much more energy do we have to kind of keep pushing to making people care about it? Because it has died down. It has gotten a bit quieter at the moment. And I think that's kind of what worries me. Like, for some, it was a performative. It was a kind of aesthetic. You saw people in taking Instagram pictures and then getting back in their car to go about their day kind of thing. People getting drunk at the protest. And, it was kind of frustrating when you see these things because, there's a lot of people who are just doing it for the image, for the kind of social media posts and the kind of, like, influencer look. And I think it will be interesting to kind of see how does this pan out. However, I have also seen organizations taking a stand against kind of like racism, kind of putting in recommendations and what they're going to do to make their places more inclusive. But overall, with the Black Lives Matter movement and in regards to police brutality, there's a massive conversation right now about abolishing police. A lot of people have become abolitionists and want to abolish the police altogether and have a different type of establishment. What that looks like, I'm still reading up on it. I have no idea. But I know that there's this discussion around how useful are the police? You know, how have they protected us at all? Have they ever protected Black people? Is there potential that they can be a protective mechanism, or is it always going to be an abuse of power because that's how they are structurally set out to be? And I think that's what will be interesting to see. And one last thing that gives me hope is that Angela Davis, of course, who's a prominent activist, said that, you know, in her whole career as an activist, her whole life, this is the first time that she's seen a different type of change. You know, there's something different in the air that she's seeing in terms of like the protest and, you know, the movement. And I think that's another thing that gives me hope, because if somebody who is of that much of importance and has been on the front lines for many, many years in the civil rights movement and other kind of against racial injustices, then maybe this is the time that things will continue to change alongside the use of social media. So I'm hopeful, 50%.
Bjorn, what is your taking on this?
You're much more optimistic than I am, which is so by that I mean that like those of us who've been there will be there. The front lines are not gonna go away anytime soon, and they were there for decades. I mean, I've met with activists who walked with Dr. King in the 60s, who have been living their lives fighting this fight. And certainly there's a large amount of people who've been doing that. And I think that amount of people is hopefully going to grow as a result of this. The protests right over the past couple of weeks are dwindling down right now. There's less of them internationally and less of them in the US, it seems. But it's been a starting point for a lot of really cool things. I think some new recruits have come to join the ranks of the people who are dedicating their lives to this activism, and I think that's really great. But at the same time, I also think there's been a lot of Instagram activism, which having momentum on Instagram might help change the policies of some corporations. It might even help change some policies of some international institutions or even governments. And it's certainly been an interesting start to a debate about the role of the police in our society, both in the US society and in the rest of the world. I mean, we started working on policing in the context of combating radicalization into extremism about a decade ago, and started working on community policing and what it means to essentially restructure the way in which the police works from being a violent force to being a force that is supportive of the community, and what that entails in terms of also having other capacities than just police officers involved in making our communities healthier and better. And I think that's a really kind of interesting direction things are going in now, where we're seeing more of a debate about the role of like mental welfare workers, people who are community workers, people who are working with essentially rehabilitation and integration of societies and communities that have a lot of tension and conflicts within them. And I think there are interesting directions in which the whole defund the police, abolish the police versus change the ways in which policing is done is happening. I also think in context of what we talked about protests and violence, if the police has been de facto the state's way of monopolizing violence, and that was never really the intention when it came to how the US should function. Like the Second Amendment is there to protect against the monopolization of violence. Like you can say a lot of bad things about the Second Amendment activists, but it could also be read as an understanding of violence should not be monopolized by the state. And so the state should disarm and be less violent against its people, is kind of the flip end of that. And I think that's a really interesting flip end to explore in greater depth and look at how do we create a non-violent contract between the people and the police, in which law enforcement is not necessarily law enforcement in the violent sense, but in trying to prevent crime or the root causes of crime in a more community health oriented way. So there's some really interesting things that are happening. At the same time, I think those are discussions and debates that will be continued by the people who are willing to read more than a tweet about it. And unfortunately, I think that's the minority of people. I think a lot of people are wanted to get out of their houses and take to the streets right now. I think a lot of people wanted to look like they were doing the right thing and take the Instagram photos. I don't know how many of them will be left in a couple of weeks when it's no longer the hip thing to be a nerd who nerds out about community policing and speaks about the ways in which policy is made for the future and tries to shape the future of the world in mechanisms or through mechanisms and means that are less flashy and less sexy on Instagram. So we'll see. But I think change will happen. I think a lot of change is about to happen, and I think, like, in that respect, I'm optimistic. I'm just not optimistic to the scale of the protest maintaining momentum in the same way it has. And that goes back to, we saw the Women's March after Trump was elected, and then about 4 years later, we had Joe Biden, who has a sketchy record, be elected as through the primaries as kind of the opposition to Trump. This doesn't bode well for the way in which women's rights are being protected in the US. We saw March for Our Lives happening after the school shooting in Parkland. And that dwindled down, and school shootings are still happening, and violence is still a massive issue. We've seen Black Lives Matter protests flare up in the past, and we've seen them dwindle back down. It's kind of the ebbs and flows of these things. But I really think that this drawing so much attention right now has led to real change. It's led to the NFL completely changing their policy on anti-racism work, which is a massive symbolic thing. It's changed how NASCAR is viewing the use of the Confederate flag, which might be a massive thing for those are kind of the two largest sports in the US, which is weird because both of them are really lame. I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for saying that. But it certainly changed the imagery, at least, around things. And so I hope the change isn't just going to be at the surface level, but also going to stick deeper and go into the policy space and into the way in which the business of the world is run. But we'll see.
Thank you. Now, you also both mentioned, well, first of all, that also youth and young people, they played a role so far. So how, or what will their role be if that becomes now a global movement? And also, what role do kind of non-profit organizations play? You just mentioned some organizations, also companies on a different level. Now there's a lot of course, NGOs, non-profit organizations, who also do have a cause, who fight for something. So what do you think is their role in all of this?
Non-governmental organizations are playing the roles in this. There's a lot of different things that have been around again since the civil rights era, with things like the Southern Poverty Law Center and other organizations that have been working against racism and structural racism for decades already. And I think the legacy of those is certainly strong and certainly something that's working for. I also think, as Nasra touched upon, there's been a lot of things going on GoFundMe and stuff to fund legal protection for those who have been arrested as part of the protests, etc. I think that engagement is really cool. I think Black Lives Matter and the people who are running organizations affiliated with that are certainly having an opportunity now to raise funds for their cause, which is really good. And so, like, all of those things are going to shape in one way or another. I hope it shapes in a way that is really using the means they are acquiring right now for real change. At the same time, I also think there are the players out there who are using this for their own profit, for their own benefit. There are kind of going to be the marketing campaigns that are building off of this in the private sector space that are essentially trying to profiteer on this movement rather than necessarily genuinely try to support it. We're going to see companies that are branding their clothes with Black Lives Matter, while those clothes are made by essentially slave labor in Southeast Asia or in Sub-Saharan Africa, even. And there's going to be a lot of strange things going on in that space. And I think in terms of where we're going to go as individuals out of this, we need to be conscious about who we are supporting and essentially who we are. I don't like the term vote with your dollar because I don't use dollars that often. But where do we place our investments? Where do we spend our money? Which organizations are we supporting? We need to be conscious of who they are and what they do and where our stuff comes from. And I think using our influence as consumers and as donors and as supporters of causes, we need to be conscious of those things. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
Thank you, Bjorn. So, Nasra, what do you think?
Yeah, just to kind of add on to that, I think it's really important that NGOs and other kind of charitable organizations recognize that they're not exempt from having institutional racism within their own organizations. And I think that's one thing that also needs to be kind of remembered and looked at is, how are you treating your Black employees and your other employees of color in the organization? Because I think this is one frustration that has I've seen happen quite a lot, especially in kind of the charitable space, is that we're seeing all these organizations that are doing great work to kind of support I guess people of color on a kind of like an external basis, but on an internal basis, that what is actually going on and how are the people of color employees being treated, especially Black employees. And I think that's one thing that is a responsibility of NGOs to kind of target and look at. And I think secondly, also which was also touched upon, is just this exploitation thing too, is how is kind of NGOs and kind of contributing to the exploitation of those that they're fighting for, if that makes sense. Is this something that is happening? And secondly, is it a case where the NGOs that exist in certain countries are just kind of utilizing Black and brown bodies to kind of further their own agenda and their own mission within their organization? I think these are the things that I would like NGOs and charities to look at. Yes, raising awareness, absolutely, and fighting the cause and being very up to date with it, but more actively, how in the countries that you're working in as an NGO, what are you doing over there? What work are you doing over there, and is it relevant? And when we start asking this is when a lot of organizations will start to shake and they will start to get scared, because they're like, oh, hold on, now we have to look at ourselves. And I think it's a very important thing that NGOs are not kind of seen as kind of by definition that they're great entities and they don't have any faults and they're on the right side of history. But in fact, there is an exploitation that happens because of NGOs. There is abuse against especially in countries within Africa where NGOs that exist there and are kind of exploiting African children and kind of exploiting a lot of just civilians over there. And I think it's really important that these are things that are addressed. This is part of Black Lives Matter. It's not just a case of, okay, cool, that police brutality. These are things that we also need to address that come under racism and come under the fact that Black and brown bodies are seen as just disposable entities or entities that are used in anyhow, especially when they're poor. So I think that's what I would kind of mention in regards to what responsibility NGOs hold and charitable organizations.
Thank you both for your perspective. And I would like to switch now from the sole Black Lives Matters movement to also other movements. Like, for example, another movement that's been going on for decades and decades is the ecological movement on sustainability and kind of saving the environment and our Earth. And now, let's say, compared to the recent development of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was last year a little bit more of momentum, especially also when Greta Thunberg was giving her speech, and then people, of course, put their attention on it. So now we have the Black Lives Matter movement. And what do you think? What would need to happen in order for also the sustainable ecological movement become a matter that actually, matters to really everyone, just the same as we experience it just now?
So I think like the sustainability movement, the ecological movement, it started in the late 60s, like so much else. It started with a massive oil spill in Santa Barbara that led to the World Day, um, and that led to the kind of growth of the UN agencies for environmental protection that launched in 1972 at the Stockholm Congress. And then now we have kind of this flare up with Greta's efforts, but environmental protection was still a part of the um, millennial goals. It was part of the it's still part of the sustainable development goals, and so that's an integrated part of the way in which we do kind of international relations these days. And so I think like that movement it's important. It's important that we all take part in that, and that like Fridays for Future and stuff like that goes on in some way or another. We need to keep it on top of our agendas. But one of the issues when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's somewhat seen as detached from international relations, even though it's not. Um, I think it needs to be framed more as a human rights movement. It needs to be framed as an international movement that as something that matters everywhere, not just in the streets of the US, but in every corner of the world. And I think that is going to be a real challenge because at the end of the day, most of our countries are human rights abusers. Um, and I think that's it requires people to see themselves in the mirror in a very different way. So like when it comes to environmentalism, like we can all think that it's cool to drive electric cars because it's becoming cool to drive in electric cars, but dealing with our heritage as human rights oppressors and as racists, it's not fun and it's not sexy and it doesn't look good. Like we are gonna have to deal with the fact that we're not gonna look good for a while. Um, and I think that's really challenging um, at personal level for a lot of people. But it's also really challenging from an international relations perspective because countries depend on looking as good as possible and um, going into the depths of how are you addressing racism in your own society is going to be a real challenge when it comes to that. So like having worked against far right extremism and racism in Europe for the better part of the last decade, it's been really hard to get it to be seen as an issue at all because really we don't want to talk about our own shit, and our entire foreign policy and our own entire policy is really built on like let's make peace over there and not really look at like what all the issues are over here. Um, and it's a really kind of smoke and mirrors approach to making the world seem better without actually making it better. And I think that's at the heart of what has to change for this to become kind of more sustainable thing at a more global stage, and also elevated to the levels of international policy where it should be and where it needs to be. Like we need to essentially take the police in the US to The Hague for human rights abuse or for crimes against humanity. I mean, like, yeah, if we get to that level, then we're starting to talk real deals. But for now, we are kind of just meddling in the water.
Thank you. And Nasra, what's your perspective on this?
I agree with everything that's being said, and I think it's quite interesting that when you look at kind of the movement around sustainability and the environment, I think for a lot of people it's easier to kind of see the benefit for everybody compared to, I guess, when it comes to fighting for a certain group of people to have the same rights as you. I think that's why it's much more harder, I guess, unfortunately, to get people to be on board and to actually be like, you know what, this is something that I need to fight for because it's the right thing to do. Whereas when it comes to environment and sustainability, it's like, okay, like if I don't fight for this, then this is going to affect me and impact me directly. And I think that's kind of like the big difference here. Will it be kind of impactful in the same sense? I think it can be, but I think I think a lot of it kind of relies on this idea that, you know, again, that we will admit that white supremacy exists and white privilege, and we want to dismantle that. White privilege and white supremacy benefits those in power the most because it's predominantly white people in power. And I think, again, if you look at to what extent does one impact more so than the other, obviously environmental issues impact everybody more so than kind of upholding white supremacy and white privilege. And I think that's what's going to be hard to kind of crack in order to keep this movement sustainable and as impactful as, I guess, the movement around environment. And I think there's also even in the movement of kind of like the fighting for climate change and I guess fighting against climate change. I think it's quite interesting that the way that people were handled during those protests was much more it was in a much more nicer way than, I guess, black protesters and protests around like Black Lives Matter in some sense, because again, there was one individual who went to a protest in London for Extinction Rebellion when the kind of it was at its height, and my organization, the way I work, they were like, okay, we need to make a statement of support for this person and we need to kind of be in solidarity with them. And I thought at first I was like, okay, cool, like I get it, that's great. Like, you know, we're fighting against climate change, and this person that we're putting a statement out for who works in the same organization has been arrested, and we're going to kind of say like we stand with them. But I thought to myself, if this was like a Black Lives Matter protest and the person that got arrested from the organization was a black person, you know, they were in jail, would we have the same energy or would we be hesitant? And I think there's this privilege and this idea of kind of who do we listen to and who do we support when it comes to these movements. And we see it very clearly with, you know, if we compare the movement around climate change, even though climate change has an element of racial injustice as well, compared to, I guess, the Black Lives Matter movement. So yeah, I think it'll be, again, is an interesting conversation to have.
Thank you, Nasra. Now I have one last question, and I guess that's interesting for each and every one of us. Basically, Nasra, you said also just now that this is the first time that you can feel something different in the air from the perspective of change. And of course, there's also a lot of critics who might say that the protests and movements have done little to sway politics and policy on social justice, equal rights, or climate change. So that can be very demotivating also for young people. When you have the feeling that, yes, you have a big passion about something, but no matter what you do, nothing's really moving. So what is your suggestion to individuals and also especially young people? How can they act and what can they do when they feel passionate about a cause, but they might not believe or don't have that much faith in the results?
Oh, sure.
I can go, or you can go.
Go ahead.
Rockers and scissors and whatnot. I think one of the things that like keeps me either motivated or depressed, depending on what day it is, to recall the fact that it took about 80 years from car seatbelts, like seatbelts for cars, were invented and made publicly available. Like they were openly licensed, so all car manufacturers could use them. It took 80 years from that happened to they were mandatory by law in most countries where cars are manufactured. And so public policy, and especially when it comes to things that changes how people live their lives, takes a long time. It takes a ridiculous amount of time, and it might be demotivating to think that things are taking a lot of time, but at the same time, it's also motivating to think that like things are changing more rapidly in some ways now than what they were with seatbelts. We're able to change things more quickly, and I think it's uphill battles, and we know that change takes time, and we need to be in it for the long haul. And so, like getting down to it and keep on grinding is kind of the only way to go. But if we want to make the world better for everyone, we need to keep on fighting, and we need to keep in mind that even though it takes decades, even though like this is something our fathers and forefathers have been fighting for, something that our children and grandchildren might keep on fighting for, it is worth it. We're on the right side of history here, and that's kind of the way in which we should keep on pushing for change. I know that sounds like halfway depressing, with things taking a long time, but I think it's really also uplifting to think that yeah, these things take time, and we have a sense of urgency. We hope that things will change over the next couple of weeks. They will not change over the next couple of weeks, but maybe they will change in another couple of decades' time. Maybe somewhere in the future there is a better future, and I think like every day as well, like things are changing, things are getting better. We're getting a better future tomorrow than what we had today, and that's also a good thing to keep in mind. Nasra, be more uplifting than me.
Oh, I feel like I think in terms of just kind of being motivated, I think one thing that I like to look at, or one thing that I like to kind of keep in mind, is the wins that have happened over the last, I guess, months, weeks, years, just to see like what impact has actually movements around the world had on their countries and just this space. And I think that's really important to look at, because sometimes human beings love to be, we want to be like, oh, like nothing's changing, like it's taking too long, which a lot of the times it is. But I think when you actually kind of sit down and be like, you know what, let me look at what have we won, like what have we actually changed. And I think when we look at that, I'm like, oh, hold on, like the movement is actually doing something, whether it's small, big, whether it's changing policy or changing somebody's life. We're trying to save somebody, off kind of getting them out of jail, or ensuring that somebody, is prosecuted for the police brutality, which obviously is still something that's not happening, but we're pushing for. And I think it's these things that I guess we need to look at that are being impactful, because on the bigger wide in on a structural sense, yes, the change is going to take longer, but I think on a smaller scale, on an individual direct impact kind of sense, I think the change that we're seeing already is that a lot of people's minds are changing. People who didn't think about racism before, or Black Lives Matter, or didn't actually believe it in their core, are thinking about it now and are being great allies. And I think for me, when I see it on a direct basis, when I see the person next to me, the person I work with, messaging me like, yo, like I've been reading up on this, like, I got you, and I can see them being great allies and great bystanders. For me, I'm thinking, wow, like imagine the change that's happening elsewhere. Imagine the mindsets of people that are changing. And I think that's what keeps me motivated, and that's what I think hopefully will keep a lot of young people motivated, is that their friends, their family members, people around them are starting to kind of back the case and kind of have those conversations, because that's all we have that's going to keep us motivated at the moment, because it's exhausting. It is exhausting, and self-care is really important, that we take care of ourselves during this time and during being an activist. I'm sure all of us know how hard it is to be an activist and how hard it is to kind of fight any cause, because when it's so close to your heart and you're emotionally attached to it, then you think about it all the time. It's something that hurts you, every time you're trying to have a discussion about it, and somebody says something that you don't agree with, or, something that you want to change is not changing. It's going to hurt you directly, because you're part of it as much as, you're fighting against it kind of thing. So I think that's, for me, I would say, is remembering what we're here to do and what we've won so far and what our ancestors have won and what the people before us have won. And I think that's why it just shows that anything is possible, especially in this day and age where everything is happening so quickly. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you, Nasra, and also thank you, Bjorn, on sharing your perspectives and giving some more value and action steps for our audience and community. Now, I guess we're at the end of the questions that we have. Saida,
Yeah, just anyone who has questions, because I've got one question sent to me for Nasra, but anyone wants to speak up and raise the question? If not, then I will gonna read the question that I've got for Nasra and Bjorn. No? Okay, so the question that I got is about against the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's more on the I guess also perception of what's going on in the movement from Dmitry. He asks like about how do you separate the radical element from the movement, whether you need actually to separate it, because you already started the conversation about violence and acceptance of violent methods, direct methods. But he asked whether the movement requires the purification from these radical elements in order to be viewed as something that can be supported by a bigger number of people and have like a more collaborative approach. So if you want to.
Okay. I think for me, I think the question is, does it, as you've asked, kind of thing, like, does it need to be, does the radical element need to be taken out of the movement, is my question. Because I think for me, no. And I think radical kind of, Black Lives Matter is radical in its sense, existing as a Black person is radical. And I think the thing is that, do we take out the negative aspects of Black Lives Matter movement? Yes, of course. The thing that the areas of any movement, always there's a small number that exploit the movement to kind of for their own gains. But I think what we need to recognize is that, like, the radical part of the movement is what has driven it for so long and has driven a lot of the change within the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think this is something I feel like, not, and when I say radical, I don't mean having violence. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Violence is different to having a radical. Radical is having a radical thought, such as abolition of police, or kind of what kind of rights we want for Black people, what kind of rights we want in general. What does it mean to kind of stand in the face of authority and actually demand certain things? That's all of these things are radical, because your life is at risk. And I think it's kind of, I think a lot of people try and taint this movement of Black Lives Matter with kind of saying that maybe it needs to be a bit more peaceful and whatnot. But I think what we need to recognize is that direct action is what has caused a lot of change over these years. And I think it's something that we need to hold on to. And again, Angela Davis, who's a very prominent figure in this movement, has also said that, radical kind of action and radical element of the Black Lives Matter movement and just the civil rights movement is what created change and is what is needed to harbor in order to kind of make change. And I think one thing that we also remember is that Black people are not a homogenous group. Black people are not a homogenous kind of entity where they all have the same feelings and the same way of kind of dealing with things. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King did not agree on their methods. Do you know what I'm trying to say to you? Yet both had some impact, some positive impacts on society and how the rights of like Black people when the civil rights movement was happening. So I think these are things that we need to take into consideration. And I think the bigger question is, how do we ensure that this radical movement, because it is a radical movement, stays alive, rather than how do we water down and remove the radicalism from Black Lives Matter? Because we need to remember that existing as a Black person is a radical in today's day and age. And I think that's what some people don't realize, is that when we go to the shops, it's a radical movement, because who knows if you're going to come back alive, especially as a Black man. And I think these are things that we need to remember. So that's what I would say to that question.
Thank you. Thanks. Hope that answered. Bjorn, would you like to add something? Because you're the expert on radicalism, so I'm sure that you have your say.
My expertise is in radicalization into violent extremism that leads to terrorism. Like, violent extremism that leads to terrorism is very different from the radical movement that is Black Lives Matter. I think the movement is inherently radical, and I think it should remain inherently radical. Like, the idea that we're all equal is surprisingly radical in this day and age. It's radical for me as a white guy to hold that thought that we should all be equal. It's radical for Black people to call for their own lives to matter. It is a inherently radical movement, and I think that's a really great thing. Now, when it comes to things like looting, when it comes to things like violence, I'm not talking violence against property. Like, I'm all for like tear down the statues and like spill paint on whichever things you want to. When it comes to like actual violence against people, it's worth keeping in mind like whether the means or the ends justify the goal. I think for so long, Black people have been oppressed, and there's been a lot of violence against Black people, and there is this sense of like, are Black people gonna avenge themselves on white people? I think that's a fear among some white people, and I think like uh, having been a victim of violence myself, like I think like the thought doesn't really cross the minds of most people. Like most Black people wants to live in peaceful communities with white people. Um, like we as white people don't have anything to fear. A lot of the people who are white and who are fearful of losing their privilege. And what I have to say today is like, we're not gonna lose our privilege. We're just gonna extend the privilege to everyone. Like everyone should have the same um, level of privilege. Everyone should be able to feel safe. Everyone should be able to feel that they have the right to live in their neighborhoods. And like all of these are radical ideas. And so maintain the radicalism is definitely a core element. It's also important to remember that a lot of the focus on violence is directly used as a tool to delegitimize the protests. So, like when the media is reporting on looting, when they're reporting on destruction of property, when they're reporting on direct violence against people at like a massively overscaled level compared to the percentage of the protest that actually is. That is a strategy used to maintain the status quo. By the media, by those who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And I think that's a core thing to remember. Like, they don't tell the truth. Like, it's not proportional to what is going on at all. The vast majority of the protests, the vast majority of the movement is nonviolent, is peaceful, and wants to create a space for coexistence. Secondly, it's also worth remembering that a lot of the violence and a lot of the looting and a lot of the destruction of property is actually perpetrated by people who have gone out to do that, to delegitimize the protests. And we have a fairly good amount of records from various far right extremist communities, from Nazi communities, of people who have dressed up as Black Lives Matter protesters and gone to protests just to cause trouble, just to delegitimize the protests. And so it's worth remembering that the violence is also used as a tool to delegitimize the protest by those who already are on the opposing side of the protests. Also, we've seen escalations of violence by the police departments, by law enforcement. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that, yes, the movement is radical and that is good. Let's keep it radical. And let's keep in mind that the focus and the attention drawn to the violence and to the more harmful elements is to a large part disproportional, and is to also a large part perpetrated by people who don't have the best interest of the movement at heart. And we shouldn't let that distract us from what's really important here and what is the core issue, and that is that Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Anyone has any question? Okay, so no questions means that actually we gave a pretty full answers. Like those answers that were given by you guys is covered a lot of areas that been raised by our audience, some of the questions that we heard from our community, something that came from the media. And I want to thank you for your time, and thank you for this important conversation and these radical thoughts that you shared with us at the very end of our conversation that we all need to keep in mind. And I think that would be something to leave this with and start thinking for themselves. And I think that yeah, it's been a pleasure. I myself definitely going with lots of thoughts and a lot of things to think over. Michelle?
Yeah, thank both of you for your time and also your perspectives and opinions. I found it very interesting. Also to understand some links that I haven't made before. So same for me. Well, it definitely gave me a lot of thoughts. Yeah, I'm probably gonna take some of it also for the weekend as a specific session where I'm just gonna sit down and reflect on what was said today. So thank you, and also thank the audience for having been here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Michelle and
Thank you.
Taylor,
It's been a
hosting
pleasure.
this. And,
Thank you very much, guys. It was great to see you, and thank you for the great insights.
Oh,
thank you. It's been really awesome to hang out for like an hour and a half and yell about this stuff.
It just passed by. All right. Well, thank you so much. Hopefully see you around. We'll follow your activism, your activities, and best of luck. And thank you for joining.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya.